Some traps aren't built with walls, they're written in ink. Claire Bennett thought she could walk away from Daniel Whitmore, a man whose name opened doors and closed them just as fast. She wasn't running from the paycheck. She was running from the weight in her chest every time she stepped into his office, but when she tried to quit, he didn't let her go. Instead, he handed her a contract worth 3 times her salary and a cage she couldn't see until the door had already closed. What would you do if the very thing you wanted to escape became the one thing you couldn't afford to lose? Would you fight until you broke free, or stay long enough to find out why you can't let go? This is the story of a cold millionaire, a stubborn assistant, and the unexpected ways 2 guarded hearts can change each other. If you've ever wondered how love can slip through the cracks you swore you'd keep closed, this is for you. Stay with us until the end, and if this story moves you, like, share, and tell us in the comments what you would have done in Claire's place. Now, let's begin. It wasn't the number on her paycheck that made Claire want to leave. It was the weight in her chest every time she stepped into his office. Whitmore Financial's top floor always carried a different kind of air cooler, quieter, more deliberate. The walls of glass framed the New England harbor in silver and slate, the kind of view that made visitors stop mid-sentence. Down below, cranes moved with slow precision, gulls traced loops over the water, and the scent of salt rode the wind even up here. Daniel Whitmore's name was etched into the glass door in understated gold. He had built this place from nothing, no family trust, no silent partner, just long hours, steady decisions, and an unwillingness to quit. At 42, he was the kind of man people noticed without meaning to. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't rush. But when he looked at you, you felt as if he could see every hidden calculation in your head. Claire Bennett had been his assistant for almost a year. 32 years old, practical, and unflappable. She'd lasted longer than anyone else in the role. She knew when to hand him the file without being asked, when to keep a client talking while he read the market report, when to let silence do the work. She respected the man. Sometimes she even admired him. But lately, the cost of working in his shadow had been building up like silt at the bottom of a tide pool, slow, heavy, and hard to see until it was too much. That morning, she walked into his office holding a plain white envelope. Her knuckles felt cold around it. Daniel was bent over a folder, his pen moving in deliberate strokes. He didn't look up when she entered. "Good morning," she said, her voice steady. "Morning," he replied, still writing. She stepped closer, placed the envelope in the center of his desk. The polished walnut reflected its edges. Only then did he set his pen down, align it with the pad beside him, and slide a finger under the flap. He unfolded the single sheet, scanned it once, and then again. "You're resigning," he said, the words calm but final. "Yes," she answered. He leaned back slightly. "Why I need to move on." To what she met his gaze, something better. The corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile, not quite disbelief. "Do you have any idea how many people would want your job? I'm not other people. Mr. Whitmore." The air between them shifted, like a door quietly closing. His eyes, a winter gray today, held hers without blinking. "You've been good at this. Efficient. Reliable. Thank you." So why now? She thought of all the missed dinners with friends, the weekends cut short, the calls to her brother Mark that always seemed to start with, "Sorry, I'm at work." She thought of how her own life had been reduced to the color-coded blocks on his calendar, but she kept those reasons to herself. "It's just time," she said. His expression didn't change, but there was a pause, a longer one than usual, before he spoke. "When were you planning to leave?" I can stay 2 weeks to help train someone new." He shook his head once. "No need. We'll manage." The dismissal was clean, but not convincing. Claire had worked with him long enough to know when something was still turning over in his mind. She gathered her breath. "I'll make sure everything is in order before I go." Daniel glanced down at the letter again, then folded it with precise care. "We're not done here. Claire." Her fingers tightened on the folder she carried. "With respect, I think we are." He didn't answer, only watched her for a beat longer before setting the paper aside. The conversation was over, at least for now. Claire turned, her heels soft on the carpet, and stepped into the hallway. The glass walls reflected the harbor light onto the floor in pale strips. She kept her head high, but her pulse was uneven. Back at her desk, she began typing the morning's agenda. The office hummed with the usual rhythm, phone lines clicking open and shut, printers sighing, the muted chatter from the floor below. Nothing had changed, and yet she felt a subtle current under the surface, a shift she couldn't quite name. When she glanced toward Daniel's office, he was already on the phone. His posture relaxed, but his gaze angled toward the window. She couldn't tell if he was looking at the harbor or thinking about her resignation letter. Either way, something in his eyes when he'd spoken stayed with her. It wasn't anger. It wasn't surprise. It was something sharper, a glint of resolve. She tried to push the thought aside, but it clung to her as the day moved on. And by the time the sun slipped lower over the water, she realized she believed him. They weren't done. Not yet. She came for a paycheck. He gave her a prison made of paper and ink. The next morning, Claire stepped into the elevator with a cardboard box under her arm. It held the framed photo of her brother Mark, the small plant she kept by the window, and a mug she'd brought from home with a tiny chip on the rim. She planned to pack the rest of her things quietly, hand in her key card, and leave before anyone started asking questions. The ride to the top floor felt longer than usual. The hum of the cables, the faint scent of the building's lemon cleaner, it all pressed in on her. When the doors opened, the familiar view of the harbor spilled in, bright under a pale autumn sun. Her desk looked the same as she'd left it the night before, except for the envelope. It was thick, cream-colored, with her name written in neat block letters. Not Daniel's handwriting. He never wasted time on that, but she knew it came from him. Claire set the box down, slit the envelope open, and pulled out a sheaf of papers. The header at the top read, "Employment Agreement." She skimmed the first few lines. Salary triple her current pay. Term 12 months, non-negotiable. Exit clause so steep she'd owe more than she could earn in a year. The words were crisp, impersonal, yet they closed in around her like steel bars. By the third page, her stomach felt tight. She marched to his office, the papers in hand. Daniel was at his desk, jacket off, shirt sleeves rolled once. The harbor light cut across his face, sharpening the lines she knew by heart from a year of watching him work. "What is this?" she demanded, laying the contract flat in front of him. He didn't even glance at it. "A solution. It's a trap," she shot back. "It's business," he said, his tone even. She blinked at him. "You can't make me stay." "You're free to decline," he replied smoothly. "But I'll be clear if you walk away. You won't work in this industry again. Not here. Not in Boston. Not in New York. My network is broad." Her fingers clenched on the edge of the desk. "That's not fair. Fairness isn't part of the job description," he said, still calm. "Competence is, and you're good at this, Claire." The way he said her name low, deliberate, made something twist in her chest. She wanted to argue, to tell him no amount of money could buy her freedom, but the truth pressed in, heavy and unwelcome. Mark's tuition bill was due next month, her rent had gone up, the car's check engine light had flickered on again last week. And even if she found another job quickly, it wouldn't pay enough to keep her afloat. "You think you can buy my loyalty," she said quietly. "I don't think," Daniel answered. "I know." She stared at him, searching for a crack in his expression. There was none, only patience, and that faint, infuriating certainty. Back at her desk, she sat with the papers for a long time. Her coffee went cold. She read each clause twice, her eyes snagging on words like non-compete and termination penalty. Every sentence seemed to close another door. She thought of the times she'd told herself she could leave whenever she wanted, that she was here by choice. Now, choice felt like a word from someone else's language. By mid-afternoon, she knew what she had to do, not because she wanted to, but because she couldn't see a way around it. When she returned to his office, contract in hand, Daniel was on the phone. He looked up, held her gaze as he finished his call with a brisk, "We'll discuss it tomorrow." She placed the signed papers on his desk. "It's done." For the first time all day. His mouth curved, not a full smile, but enough to let her know he'd won. It wasn't gloating. It was something quieter, more dangerous. "Good," he said, sliding the contract toward him. He tapped the last page with one finger, where her signature lay in dark ink. "Starting Monday, you'll work by my side." Up close, Daniel Whitmore was even more dangerous. For nearly a year, Claire had worked for him at a comfortable distance close enough to anticipate his needs, far enough to breathe. She'd been the buffer between him and the rest of the office, the voice on the phone, the hands preparing documents, the person quietly making things happen without stepping into his shadow for too long. Monday changed that. The elevator ride to the top floor felt longer than it ever had. She carried no box this time, only her well-worn leather planner, its pages crammed with neat handwriting and colored tabs. Her stomach tightened as the door slid open. The executive floor had its own kind of gravity. Conversations seemed quieter here, as if the glass walls might shatter if voices rose too high. People moved with a deliberate swiftness, glancing up briefly before returning to their screens. Her new desk sat directly outside Daniel's private office, a wall of frosted glass and a heavy oak door separating them. But she already knew that door would open often and that the separation was more symbolic than real. At 8:55 a.m., she stepped into his office with the morning reports. Daniel was behind his desk, reading from a sleek tablet. The harbor light poured in behind him, making the sharp lines of his suit seem darker, more defined. "You're late," he said without looking up. She blinked, glanced at her watch. "It's not 9 yet. You should have been here by 8. That's not in the contract," she replied, keeping her tone level. That drew his eyes up from the screen. There was a faint curve to his mouth, not quite a smile, more like a private acknowledgement. "Contracts are guidelines. Claire, I value loyalty over fine print." She held his gaze a moment, then set the reports on his desk. "Then you'll have them at 9. As agreed. For a moment, the air between them felt charged, as if a thread had been pulled taut. He didn't push, and she didn't retreat. "Close the door," he said finally, his attention returning to the tablet. The rest of the morning was a steady current of tasks, conference calls with overseas clients, last-minute changes to presentations, tracking down a missing shipment report. Daniel's expectations were exacting. He noticed when a page number was off in a draft. He caught a misquoted figure in a finance summary before she'd even finished highlighting it. But what unsettled her wasn't his precision. It was his attention. when she handed him a file. His fingers brushed her wrist brief, almost careless, but enough to make her pulse jump. When she leaned over to place documents on his desk during a call, he shifted just slightly, and the scent of his cologne cedar, with something darker beneath, slipped into her senses. It stayed with her longer than it should have. It was maddening. By lunch, she'd decided to eat at her desk, even though he'd told her earlier she was free to step out. She didn't trust herself not to think about the way he'd looked at her when she'd pushed back that morning. At 2:00 p.m., he summoned her again. "Reschedule the Simmons meeting for Wednesday," he said, eyes still on his notes, "and review the briefing file page. 5 is wrong." She nodded, jotting it down in her planner. His gaze flicked to the pen clipped inside it. "You still use that old thing?" "It works," she said. "You could have a new one." "I like this one," she answered, meeting his eyes briefly. Something passed through his expression. Amusement, maybe, or approval. He didn't comment further. By mid-afternoon, she was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the work itself. She knew how to handle pressure. What she wasn't used to was feeling as if she were under a microscope, not just her work, but her presence. At 4:30 p.m., she brought him the final revisions for a client proposal. As she placed them on his desk, his hand reached out to take them, his fingers brushing against hers in the handoff. It was nothing, really a fleeting contact. Yet she felt it all the way up her arm. "Better," he said, glancing through the pages. "Good," she replied, turning to leave. "Claire," he said before she reached the door. She paused, looking back. "I expect you here before 8 tomorrow." She raised an eyebrow. "That's not in the contract either." His eyes held hers, steady and unreadable. "Not everything worth doing is." She left without answering, but the words followed her out. Back at her desk, the harbor's late-day light spilled in, turning the water a deep copper. She told herself she could keep this strictly professional. She had signed the contract, but she hadn't agreed to let him inside her head. Still, when she caught his reflection in the glass wall as he moved inside his office, she realized something unsettling. She wasn't sure she was winning that battle. Sometimes the city was quiet enough for truths to slip out. By the time the clock on Claire's desk read 9:30, Whitmore Financial was silent. The hum of the air system filled the empty halls, and the faint clink of water against the harbor walls drifted in from the open vent. Downstairs, security would be doing their slow walkthroughs, checking locks and lights. Up here on the top floor, only 2 offices still glowed, hers and his. Claire liked the stillness. In the absence of ringing phones and quick footsteps, she could finish her work without interruption. Tonight, it was a vendor contract, dense paragraphs in fine print that she had read so many times the words blurred. The creak of Daniel's door broke her focus. She looked up to find him leaning against the frame. His dark jacket was gone, his white shirt sleeves rolled neatly to his forearms, tie loosened. In his hand, a short glass caught the lamplight, amber liquid swirling with the slow melt of 2 ice cubes. "Claire," he said, voice low but steady. "Come in." She gathered the contract and stepped into his office. At night, the space felt different, warmer, more personal. Without the distraction of sunlight bouncing off the harbor, the view was simply a dark expanse dotted with the red and white lights of distant ships. The desk lamp cast a golden pool across the walnut surface. He gestured to the chair across from him. She sat, smoothing her skirt, and waited. "You're not what I expected," he said suddenly. Her brow rose. "What did you expect?" His eyes narrowed slightly, studying her as though the answer mattered more than she realized. Fear or flattery? She allowed a faint smile. "I don't have time to fear you," And I'm not interested in flattering you." Something in his expression shifted, softened, just enough to be noticeable. "And yet," he said, quieter now, "you're still here." Her pulse gave a small jump. She could have told him she stayed because of the paycheck, the contract, the bills piling on her kitchen counter, or her brother's tuition she'd promised to help with. All of that was true. But another truth sat just beneath her ribs, one she wasn't ready to name. "I finish what I start," she said instead. He nodded as if filing that away for later. "Let me see the contract." As she handed it over, his fingers brushed the back of her hand. The touch was brief but deliberate enough to send a sharp, quiet spark up her arm. She felt it in the base of her throat. She didn't pull away. "Page 6, he said, glancing down. "The indemnity clause is too narrow. I marked it red tab," she replied. His mouth curved in the faintest acknowledgement. "Of course you did." They went over the details in low, even voices. In the quiet. Claire noticed small things, the way his eyes skimmed the page with precision, the way he rested his pen between his fingers, the steady rhythm of his breathing. Without the constant churn of the workday, he seemed less guarded. When they were done, he set the folder aside but didn't dismiss her. "Earlier, when you said you wanted something better." He paused, as if testing the weight of his next words. "I don't want to be the reason you feel smaller than you are." The honesty caught her off guard. "That's not entirely your fault," she said softly. "I'm the one who keeps saying yes." "You say yes when it matters," he answered, and the look in his eyes made her wonder what else he thought mattered. Claire pushed back her chair. "I should go." He stood too, rounding the desk, up close. She noticed the faint scar near the base of his thumb, the silver at his temples that caught the lamplight. He handed her the folder she'd brought, and again their fingers touched. This time, the warmth stayed a moment longer, just enough for her heartbeat to trip over itself. "Good night, Claire," he said. "Good night," she replied, her voice steady even if the rest of her wasn't. She stepped back into the hallway, the glow from his office spilling out behind her like a thread she could follow if she chose. At her desk, she slid on her coat, shut off her lamp, and gathered her things. As she waited for the elevator, she flexed her fingers, almost testing them, as if she could still feel the ghost of his touch there. She could, and it stayed with her as the doors closed, carrying her down into the quiet city night. The night smelled of salt air and something she couldn't name. Inside the old waterfront hotel, the Whitmore Foundation's gala washed every corner in honeyed light. Brass chandeliers threw warm halos over polished wood. A trio in the corner breathed out soft jazz upright bass, brush snare, a trumpet that knew restraint. Waiters glided past with trays of sparkling water and champagne. Through tall windows, the harbor carried a pale stripe of moon like a quiet promise. Claire told herself she was here to work. Her small black clutch held a folded agenda, donor notes, and a safety pin taped to the flap because gowns tear and panic never helps. She had rehearsed names in the cab and reminded herself to smile without offering more than professionalism. Preparation calmed her. Daniel met her in the lobby. He wore a dark suit with a midnight tie, the kind of elegance that doesn't call attention to itself until you're already looking. "Thank you for coming," he said. "It's your foundation." She replied, "I belong where the logistics are. Stay near me," he added, not quite a command, not quite a request. For a while, she did. He moved through the room with the patience of someone who values people as much as numbers. Claire leaned in close enough to murmur introductions. Dr. Mahoney, pediatric oncology. Carol Finch from Harbor Arts, and he pivoted with ease. He asked donors about kids, not checks. He listened. People noticed. When it was time for his remarks, she passed him a small card. His fingers grazed hers, light, almost accidental. The touch landed and stayed like a faint echo in the skin. His speech was short and plain. He thanked the board, staff, and donors, then spoke about small victories, warm lights in winter for after-school programs, swimming lessons in the harbor, a scholarship for a girl who fixed her neighbor's boat before school. The room answered with genuine applause. Claire felt a thin, private pride she tried not to show. After the toast, the event became a tide of conversations. A council member wanted a photo. An alum with a new company wanted to give back. A pianist asked whether the foundation still funded summer lessons downtown. Claire managed a microphone that needed attention, found a lost rap, and solved the puzzle of two guests who preferred the aisle. She moved well in a room like this, and still, she felt his attention return to her, steady and quiet. Not possession, awareness. Every time she looked up, she met it. Heat gathered under her skin. The room felt a degree too warm. She slipped through the crush, opened the balcony door, and let October air meet her face. It carried salt and the faint smell of rope. Down along the boardwalk, a ferry traced a pale line across black water. The music inside thinned into a ribbon. She set her hands on the cool stone rail and watched her breath drift. She told herself to think about table numbers, peanut allergies, and who needed to leave early. She told herself a dozen practical things because practical things were safe. The door opened behind her with a soft thud. "Too warm?" Daniel asked. "A little," she said, "or too many people?" "They come with the work," he said, stepping beside her. He kept half a pace of space. The wind lifted a strand of her hair. He reached out on instinct, then stopped, a small restraint that looked a lot like care. They stood without speaking. Far below, a buoy bell sounded once. The trumpet leaned into a standard Claire knew from her father's records. She could not recall the title. Night was in it somewhere. "You did well," she said. They listened. They listened to the idea. He answered, "That's better." He turned then, angling toward her. The distance between them closed by something smaller than a step. The balcony light found the silver at his temples. His voice lowered. "Claire." She met his eyes. She knew that tone. It was the one he used when something mattered more than the next line on the agenda. "Tell me to stop," he said, barely above the wind. The words hung like a hinge. A single answer could close the door. She could say it, walk back into the lit room, and spend the rest of the evening fixing small things. She had always been good at fixing small things. She didn't speak. Maybe silence is a kind of consent when it is chosen and clear. Maybe it is also a confession. He waited. One beat. Another. As if offering her a last clean exit. She left it there. He moved closer. No suddenness. No drama, just there. His hand found the rail beside hers. The back of his fingers touched her knuckles, a featherlight test. She didn't pull away. He leaned in. She lifted her face to meet him. The kiss was sure and carefully given, not a question, a decision. His mouth was warm. She tasted a hint of champagne, or maybe the sweetness was simply relief. One of his hands slid to the line of her jaw, light and steady. She let herself be held without being taken, and something in her chest unlocked. With a quiet click, she felt more than heard. She had expected cold shock, like falling through ice. Instead, she stepped into warmth. The world narrowed to breath and skin, and the steadiness of a man who didn't ask twice when once was enough. When they drew apart, the air between them held the heat they'd made. She kept her eyes closed for a heartbeat longer, then opened them to find him unguarded. It was a rare look on him. It undid her more than the kiss. "You didn't tell me to stop," he said. "No triumph, just truth." "I didn't want to," she answered. They stood in that small, altered weather, alone with the salt in the dark water and the trumpet holding a note that refused to rush. Then life came back. A staffer opened the door, saw them, and closed it gently. The room inside swelled with chatter. Someone tapped a glass for one last thank you. They returned because the world required it. Claire found the lost wrap's owner. Daniel shook the city councilman's hand. There were photos, then coats, then cars called to the curb. If anyone noticed the new orbit between them, no one spoke it aloud. The best secrets often begin where everyone can see them, at the doors. Daniel paused. He didn't touch her. He didn't need to. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For staying." She nodded. "Good night, Daniel." "Good night, Claire." She chose to walk. 15 blocks wasn't much in cool air. She passed the bakery that proofed dough after midnight, the small park with the iron fence, and the corner store where the owner swept his step as if it were morning already. The stars felt closer away from the hotel's light. In her apartment, she set the clutch on the narrow table by the door, turned on the lamp with the chipped base, and poured a glass of water she didn't drink. She stood by the window and watched a single taxi turn the corner. She pressed her fingertips to her lips, then let her hand fall, embarrassed by the gesture even alone. She tried to sleep. She turned the pillow, cool side up. She made a grocery list, apples by the pound, paper towels, dish soap, and forgot where she'd left off. She told herself to think about the morning's calendar. She told herself to stop thinking about the balcony. By 2, the ceiling had nothing left to say. Somewhere far off, a ship horn sounded once. She closed her eyes and saw the harbor again, and the look on his face when she didn't say, "Stop." Sleep never quite came. Morning would. The contract would still be binding. The work would still require both hands, but something under the surface had shifted for good, like tide beneath ice. "If you can prove you feel nothing, I'll let you go." The words landed between them like a line drawn in chalk, easy to wipe away. But for now, sharp enough to trip over. After the gala, Claire did her best to stay invisible. She adjusted her schedule so she arrived just after Daniel's car pulled into the garage, took lunch at odd hours, and avoided eye contact in meetings. She even swapped the order of her morning coffee run so she wouldn't cross his path in the hallway. It almost worked. On Thursday evening, she was packing up when his voice came from his doorway. "Miss Bennett, in my office." Her fingers paused on the zipper of her bag. She could pretend not to hear. She could leave and answer tomorrow, but her legs carried her inside. He stood by the window, the city's lights flickering behind him like another language. "You've been avoiding me," he said. "I've been working," she answered. "Is that what you call it?" His tone was even, but the way he moved toward her made the room feel smaller. "Because from here, it looks like you're running." She lifted her chin. "I don't run." "No," he agreed, "but you do retreat." He stopped close enough that she could see the pale scar just above his wrist. "Tell me the truth," he said quietly. "You kissed me back." Why her breath snagged. It was a mistake. Something flickered in his eyes, disbelief. Maybe, or the patience of someone who's heard a lie before. "Fine," he said, turning toward his desk. "Let's make a deal." Her pulse kicked up. "What kind of deal? 1 month," he said. "You and me, working side by side, pretending nothing happened. You don't flinch when I touch you. You don't pull away when I stand too close. You prove you feel nothing, And if I can, then I'll let you go. No contract, no threats, no reason to stay. It was madness, but so was the thought of him knowing the truth. Fine, she said. The slow curve of his mouth told her he'd already counted that as a win. Good. Starting tomorrow, the next morning, the game began. It wasn't obvious. He didn't corner her or raise his voice. Instead, he handed her a file, his fingers brushing hers just enough to notice. He stepped aside in a doorway, letting his hand rest at the small of her back for a heartbeat too long. He asked her to stand beside him during a meeting when there was no reason for her to be there. Each time, she kept her expression smooth, her voice level. Inside, she counted her breaths. By the end of the first week, Claire realized the deal was harder than she'd imagined. It wasn't the touches alone. It was the way he looked at her. Calm, steady, like he was waiting for her to break the silence with something she couldn't take back. In the quiet moments, she caught herself remembering the balcony, the cool air, the salt on the breeze, the weight of his hand against her jaw. She told herself to think about invoices and deadlines. She told herself it was just proximity and power. By the second week, he didn't have to do much at all. A glance over the top of his laptop could make her forget the sentence she was typing. The sound of his voice at her shoulder could tangle her thoughts. On Tuesday afternoon, while she was rearranging a travel schedule, he appeared beside her desk. "We're moving the Boston meeting up to Friday," he said. She nodded. "I'll book the hotel." That evening, the confirmation came back only one suite left. 2 bedrooms, 1 shared sitting area. Claire stared at the screen, her fingers hovering over the keys. She could call the hotel, try to find another place across the city, make some excuse. But she didn't. The deal was still on, after all, and Boston was only 2 days away. The harbor lights caught in his eyes, and she forgot every reason to stay away. Boston in late October felt different from their home city. The air was sharper, carrying the scent of seawater and diesel from the ferries. Their suite at the Fairmont sat high enough to see the masts swaying in the marina, strings of lights bobbing like patient constellations. Claire had told herself she'd sleep easily after a day of travel and back-to-back meetings. But when midnight came, she was still awake, the hum of the city bleeding faintly through the tall windows. She pushed back the duvet and padded into the sitting room, barefoot on the thick carpet. Daniel was there, standing by the glass. His jacket was gone, sleeves rolled to his forearms, a half-empty tumbler of bourbon in one hand. The city's glow lit the edge of his profile. "You're still up," she said quietly. He didn't turn, couldn't sleep. She hesitated at the doorway, then crossed the room. "Too much on your mind." Finally, he looked at her. Something in his expression softened, but his voice stayed even. "Just one thing." She tilted her head. "Work? No." He set the glass down on the side table with care, as if making space for the truth. "You." The word landed between them, heavier than any contract. "Daniel." "I've tried," he said, and now the quiet in his tone wasn't control. It was strain. "Tried to put distance where it should be. Tried to treat you like anyone else who's worked for me. It doesn't work." Her pulse picked up. "That's not part of the deal. I know," he said, "and I'm losing." For a moment, the only sound was the faint clink of the ice melting in his glass. Claire looked down at her hands, unsure what to do with them. She'd built weeks of walls-measured steps, neutral tones, steady breathing, and here he was, pulling at the center brick. "Say something," he murmured. She searched for the practical answer, the safe one, but found herself telling the truth instead. "I can't stop thinking about you either." His eyes darkened not with triumph, but with relief. He closed the space between them slowly, giving her time to move if she wanted to. She didn't. The second kiss came without hesitation. His hands framed her face, thumbs brushing the line of her cheekbones. This wasn't the tentative question on the balcony. This was an answer sure, steady, and deep enough to steal the air from her lungs. She let herself lean into him, feeling the heat through his shirt, the quiet thud of his heartbeat under her palms. He drew back just enough to search her face, then kissed her again, slower this time, as if memorizing the shape of her mouth. Her fingers curled into his sleeves. "Daniel," she whispered, "yes, this is going to ruin us." He gave a small, rueful smile. "Maybe. But I'm already ruined." The laugh that escaped her was soft, unguarded, and he caught it with another kiss. Later, they ended up on the couch. The city still spread beneath them, talking in low voices that slipped between serious and teasing. She told him about her brother's college applications. He told her how he'd built his first company out of a basement with no windows. Somewhere in the middle, his hand found hers, fingers lacing without thought. By the time she finally returned to her room, the harbor was paling with the first edge of dawn. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the taste of him still warm on her lips. Everything would be different now. It's not the silence that hurts. It's what you hear inside it. The flight back to New York was quiet. Not cold, not strained, just the kind of quiet where neither person knows quite what to do with the new weight between them. Claire stared out at the quilt of city lights below as the plane descended, her fingers laced in her lap. Daniel sat beside her, unreadable, but more watchful than before. In the office, nothing was said, but everything felt different. The way his gaze lingered across the boardroom table, the way his hand brushed hers when passing a file, just long enough to make her pulse stutter. Even his voice shifted, softening by degrees when he said her name. Still, Daniel kept his armor in place. Meetings ran on schedule, deadlines held, instructions were crisp, his tone the same as it had been before Boston, except for those moments when their eyes met too long. 2 weeks later, the Whitmore Foundation's autumn gala arrived. Claire had prepared every detail, seating charts, donor lists, last-minute changes to the program. She wore a dark green dress that skimmed her knees, simple enough for work, but formal enough for the event. The ballroom at the Metropolitan Club glowed in gold light. A jazz trio played in the corner, their notes mingling with the low hum of conversation. Daniel moved easily through the crowd, his tux perfectly cut, shaking hands and exchanging polite smiles. Claire stayed near the edge of the room, her clipboard tucked discreetly against her side. She was used to watching him in these settings, how he shifted from cool executive to charming host without missing a beat. But tonight, she wasn't prepared for the woman who approached him. Tall, striking, with dark hair swept into a chignon, she touched his arm like she'd done it 100 times before. Her laugh came easily, her hand lingering on his sleeve as she leaned in to say something meant only for him. Claire's stomach tightened. She didn't recognize the woman, but she recognized the ease, the familiarity of someone who knew where they stood. Daniel didn't move away. He didn't touch her back, but he didn't step aside either. He smiled faintly at whatever she'd said, and that was enough. Claire told herself it meant nothing. This was his world, people who had history with him, people she couldn't begin to compete with. She told herself she didn't care. The lie didn't hold. By the time the jazz trio slid into their last set, Claire had slipped her clipboard to a colleague and headed for the coat check. She didn't say goodnight, didn't wait for him to notice she was gone. Outside, the autumn air was cool against her bare shoulders. She walked down the block, away from the golden light spilling from the club's windows, her heels tapping against the sidewalk in a steady rhythm. In the back of a cab, she stared at the blur of streetlights and tried not to imagine what Daniel was doing now, or whether he'd even noticed. Her phone buzzed once, twice, then again. Daniel. She let it ring. By the time she reached her apartment, the calls had stopped. For the first time since she'd met him, Claire had chosen to walk away without a word, and she had no idea if he'd follow. 3 knocks, 1 voice, and the walls she'd built began to shake. Claire had woken to a pale wash of autumn light slipping through the blinds. The clock on her nightstand read 9:42 a.m. For the first time since she'd started at Whitmore Financial, she hadn't set an alarm. She'd left her phone on the kitchen counter overnight, its battery dead. The quiet in her apartment was both a relief and an ache. She made coffee slowly, measuring the grounds as though precision could steady her hands. The night before replayed in fragments the gala's golden light, the woman's hand on Daniel's arm, the way she'd left without looking back. She told herself she wasn't going to work today. She told herself she needed the distance. But underneath those reasons was something she didn't want to name: fear of what she'd see in his eyes if she went back. The knock came while she was rinsing her mug. 3 firm raps against the wood. She froze. Then his voice, low and steady through the door. "Claire." Her pulse jumped. "Don't walk away," he said. "Not now. Not ever." She pressed her hands against the edge of the counter, grounding herself. "Daniel, this isn't." She stopped, realizing she'd spoken into an empty room. "I need you to hear me," he continued. "Last night, I should have come after you. I should have explained." Her throat tightened. She stared at the door like it might open on its own. "I don't care about anyone else in that room," he said. "You're the one I watched. The one I've been watching for a long time." Her breath caught. "I've lost companies before," he said, his voice dropping lower. "I've lost money, properties, deals I thought I couldn't live without. I survived all of it. But the thought of losing you—" He paused. "That's the only thing that's ever made me afraid." Claire's fingers curled around the dish towel in her hands. She could picture him there, in the hallway, shoulders squared, jaw tight, eyes unguarded in a way she'd only seen once or twice before. Her instincts told her to keep the lock in place, to protect whatever pieces of herself she still held. But her feet moved anyway. The deadbolt clicked. When she opened the door, Daniel was standing there in a charcoal coat, the morning wind lifting the edge of his hair. For a second, neither of them spoke. Then he took a single step forward, not enough to close the door, just enough for her to feel his presence. She didn't move aside. She didn't have to. He read the answer in her eyes. He reached out, his hand warm as it found hers. Their fingers intertwined naturally, like they'd been searching for each other for years instead of months. No explanations, no bargains, just the kind of silence that says everything. Some promises aren't written in contracts. They're spoken under the open sky. The late November sun hovered just above the horizon, painting the New England coastline in molten gold. The tide rolled in with an unhurried rhythm, leaving thin ribbons of foam that curled around their boots before sliding back to sea. The air carried the briny tang of salt and the faint, woodsy scent of pine from the dunes. Daniel had told her he wanted to get out of the city for a day, but he hadn't said where they were going. Claire had simply found herself in his car, winding along narrow coastal roads until the ocean appeared in flashes between cedar-shingled houses. Now. They walked side by side on the nearly empty beach, their footprints forming a twin trail behind them. Claire's cheeks were pink from the cold, and the wind tugged a loose strand of hair across her face. Daniel reached over without a word, tucking it gently behind her ear. She smiled, a small, knowing curve of her lips. "You've been quiet all afternoon." He glanced down at her, his expression unreadable, but softer than usual. "Thinking. That's usually my job," she teased. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "Do you remember the first day you walked into my office?" Her breath formed a small cloud in the cool air. "I remember wondering if I'd last a week. I remember wondering how long it would take before you'd leave." She laughed lightly, the sound carrying on the wind. "And yet, here we are." They kept walking until the shoreline curved into a quiet alcove, sheltered from the wind by a line of jagged rocks. The sun was dipping lower now, sending streaks of amber and rose across the water. Daniel stopped, still holding her hand, and turned to face her fully. "Claire," he began, and something in his tone made her heart pick up. His other hand slid into the pocket of his coat, and when it came out, it held a small navy velvet box. She froze. "I've spent most of my life believing the only things worth keeping are the things you can control," he said. "I built companies. I signed contracts. I made sure nothing could surprise me. It kept me safe, or so I thought." The wind lifted his hair slightly as he opened the box. Inside, nestled in satin, was a diamond ring, simple, elegant, and luminous in the fading light. "But then you walked in," he continued, his voice quieter now. "And suddenly I didn't want control. I wanted you, even the parts I can't predict. Especially those." Her eyes blurred with tears, but she didn't look away. "I don't want another contract. Claire," he said, taking a small step closer. "I want forever. Will you marry me for a moment?" The only sound was the steady hush of the tide. Her mind flashed through the months they'd spent together, every argument, every reluctant truce, every moment that had shaken her guard. The way he'd looked at her in Boston, the night he'd shown up at her door. "Yes," she whispered, her voice trembling but sure. "Of course I will." Daniel's shoulders eased, and a smile broke across his face, real, unguarded, the kind she'd only seen in rare, fleeting moments. He took her left hand and slid the ring into place, his fingers warm against her chilled skin. She laughed softly through her tears. "You realize this means you're stuck with me, right?" "That's exactly what I want," he said. He leaned down, and their kiss met the edge of the sunset, warm, certain, and full of every unspoken promise between them. Her hands rose to his face, feeling the faint scratch of his beard, the way he lingered like he had all the time in the world. When they finally broke apart, the tide had crept closer, wrapping the shore in silver foam. They began to walk again, her arm tucked into his, the fading light turning the ring into a flicker of fire with every step. Claire glanced at him, catching the way his eyes kept drifting to her hand, as if to reassure himself it was real. "You're staring," she teased. "Just making sure," he said, his voice low. "Of what? That you're still here." She smiled, leaning her head briefly against his shoulder. "I'm not going anywhere." The sun slid below the horizon, leaving the sky awash in violet and gold. Their footprints stretched out behind them, side by side, a trail that the waves would soon erase. But some things the tide couldn't touch. Some loves aren't built in boardrooms or bound by paper. They're carried forward on trust, on choice, on the quiet decision day after day to stay. And as they walked into the deepening twilight, the ring catching the last light of day, Claire knew this was one promise Daniel Whitmore intended to keep for the rest of forever. In a world that teaches us to guard our hearts, it's easy to believe that control is safety. Daniel Whitmore thought contracts and rules could protect him from loss, while Claire Bennett believed walking away was the only way to preserve herself. But life often reminds us that the most meaningful connections are the ones we cannot plan for, predict, or contain. This story is a quiet reminder that love is not about winning or losing, and it's not a transaction to be negotiated. True love asks for presence, trust, and the courage to stay even when it feels easier to leave. It shows us that vulnerability isn't weakness. It's the doorway to a deeper kind of strength, the kind that binds two people not through obligation, but through choice. For anyone who has built walls around their heart, remember this safety can be comforting, but it can also be lonely. Sometimes letting someone in is the greatest risk and the greatest gift. What you hold on to most tightly might be the very thing you need to open your hands and receive. Thank you for spending your time with us and walking through this story from beginning to end. If it touched your heart, if it made you think, or even brought a smile to your day, we'd be grateful if you could give this video a like, share it with someone who might need it, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us keep bringing you more heartfelt stories that inspire, heal, and connect us all.